We are starting on Crooked Cucumber, the life and Zen teaching of Shunryu Suzuki Roshi. So the introduction to me essentially is one, David Chadwick, who I actually know when I lived at Tassajara, really authentic guy. So to me, the introduction is really he's saying, I practice Suzuki Roshi, which he did pretty early on. I got permission from his wife. Yes, there's some troubling aspects like describing her as, you know, a small person. And here it is, page XIV. Was that 14? Well, you know, Roman 14. She stood almost a foot below me. Her face was round and childlike ever, her hair long, straight, black, and just a bit of gray here and there. I don't know how many Asian people are described as small and having a round, childish face. So that's a little troublesome. And I will make a point with that later, but basically it's a trace. It's a trace, folks. We'll talk more about trace, and you well know some those on the retreat what I mean by trace, but we'll get to that in a minute. All right. The other thing I want to, this part, you know, I did not realize on page X111, he brought with him a focus on daily zazen, Zen meditation, and what he called practice. Zazen extending into all activity. Now, by that I just mean that I don't know, this is not even wise papancha, that, you know, obviously, maybe practice wasn't that big of a word until Suzuki Roshi and the whole era. I mean, now we just take it as a, you know, a regular word about practice. Like I couldn't even think of another one unless we say meditating, chanting, studying. Right? So, I don't know, maybe I was part of it. Now, I also have a little pause with on X11, Zen My Beginner's Mind, a skillfully edited compilation, blah, 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 in the end of that paragraph. He wanted to pass on what he had learned to others, and he hoped that they in turn would help to invigorate Buddhism in America and reinvigorate it in Japan. I don't know how much I've heard of that at Zen Center. It's a very different practice in Japan, and I have a tiny little experience of it. By that I mean, so much of it is about taking care of the temple, and the emphasis on just meditation, or that is being the primary purpose of practice, is very much a Western thing. And you could actually say that all across Buddhism, because in most Buddhist, as I understand, in most Buddhist culture, monastics, yes, meditate a lot, but the average person, it's not necessarily a meditator. You know, you go to the temple, you recite, you chant, there's community, you take time off to go to temple, and you perhaps very regularly, like when I practice in Thailand with the Arhat, people would travel for like an hour just to bring him food in the morning, then take a 1 or 2 hour bus to go to work, then come back at 6 o'clock to meditate with him for us for 3 hours. So, you know, every day they would do it. Right? We sat from 8 p.m. till 11 p.m. and then they came back the next morning to feed him at 7, right? a.m. So very dedicated. That's where I learned a lot about devotion. So my only point here is to say that this emphasis on meditation as what he was trying to get across, I'm not quite sure that that was his main thing. You know, he came to take care of this Sokuji, the Japanese American community, which was very much doing ceremonies. Yes, as we'll find out, the hippies came and wanted more to know only about meditation, mostly to change their mind states. So, you know, and I'm not saying it didn't resonate with him, and that's what he passed on a lot and what they picked up. I'm not denying that at all. But to say that that was his intention and that that's a revival of Japanese practice, I think we should be very leery about that. And I'm not a scholar. I'm sure we could ask someone from Zen Shuji, perhaps, you know, who, by the way, celebrated 100 years, their temple, last year, right? Okay, all right, just read things with a grain of salt. I think the thing so part of what I'm going to say is that in the next chapter, just to introduce this, childhood, chapter 1, which is page 3, I believe, yes. Our mind should be free from the traces of the past, just like the flowers of spring. Now, for those who were on retreat, you well know what we mean by traces, but I will summarize here. So in general, in our thinking, we do not see and perceive and therefore think about things as they are, like 99.9% of the time. That's what I say. Some teachers say 95%, 90. I say 99.9% of the time. Maybe that's just my experience. So the issue is that when we think or when we perceive and then think about what we perceive, and by perception, I mean the 6 senses, right? Eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, and then thinking. So we make association. You learn all this in 2.0. Lori, did you take 2.0 too? I think you did, right? The whole series? You did. Next time. So we make associations, and then we actually look for a way to verify that. And so that is already the traces. Now, our practice on a certain level is not to get rid of the traces. Our practice is to see them as traces, because we have them all the time. Those are the delusion, essentially, one way you could call them, right? And what does Dogen say? Those who know that they're deluded are enlightened. Those who think they're enlightened are deluded, right? So I'm going to try to look for my delusion, because I don't want to be an asshole, right? That's my wording, right? So not really, but I know I'm deluded. That's the point. So we want to know the traces. That's really the bulk of our practice. We want to know the traces, and here's the key. We are aware of the traces in the present. It's kind of like you read a story, right? Which, for example, as you read in chapter 1, which this is a story. This book is a story. Right? A story of someone else's life through someone else, David Chadwick's remembrance, eyes, creativity, even though he got permission from Mrs. Suzuki, right? So, and the families, right? So, our stories, we want to remember them as stories. And when we think of them now, it's a present understanding of the past or the story. For instance, there's a section in here, I didn't mark it, I don't think, where they talk about Suzuki Roshi's father, who was a priest, and I'll give you dates in a minute. He used to he used to make candles. When they're extra candles, he would take them to the market. And on the way back, the stream from upstream, old vegetable that are rotting and stuff would float down. So he would pick them up, right? Because 1, they're poor, and 2, he saw them as Buddha nature. Oh yeah, right here. I think I did say that, right? That there's Buddha nature in everything, because he was a priest too. Now, my memory of the story, it was Suzuki Roshi who did it, right? Yes, you could do that thing. You say I have false memory, but it's really, our memory is, what is it? Like the rest of everything else? Insubstantial, always changing depending on condition. Also, when we have more information, when we have more connection to it, then we'll remember it in a different way. Just like, yes, I could say, David, I don't know about saying her face is round and childlike, but I also remember David is really, my memory and many people's, he's really one of the people who were not so big about himself. Like he'd laugh about himself all the time. I heard really stories about him in very direct. Also the beginning story of how he's like, I really don't understand what you're saying, Suzuki Roshi. I've been with you 7 years and I love it. I love it, but I have no idea what you're saying. And so he's really truthful kind of guy like that, right? Really honest. And so this is from the how. The how is that he was sincere, he did his best, and there will be traces because we all have traces. So part of this is about seeing where they are. Now, I'll tell you, as I was meditating, I had a thought. Oh yeah, I want to mention that childlike face and how they're small. And then I remember when I lived in Vietnam, way before I was adopted, my mother worked at the embassy as a typing clerk. And you know, American soldiers were everywhere, right? And I always think of American soldiers, which, to be perfectly honest, in my memory, though there are plenty of people of color soldiers, but I remember just the white people, from like, that's my idea, right? And they always seem so tall. Well, of course I was a child, so that's part of it. I remember when I first met my adoptive father, Dr. Shutt, right? And being a doctor in Vietnam in the 1970s was huge, right? He just seemed a tower, like bigger than my adoptive mother. When in fact, in reality, he was 5'7" and she was 5'8". See, so our sense of things, right? He's barely taller than me, right? Now, right? Well, he's dead, but you know what I'm saying, right? So our sense of thing is always full of traces. So this is why it's not that we don't call things out or say, hey, I question your way of describing things or what your perception of truth is. This is why we practice to say, not to invalidate our truth, but to remember that our truth is limited by traces. Now, systems and culture or family might have diminished aspects of what we understand, and part of our practice is to realize that the traces from the diminishment is something we don't have to carry anymore. Remember that's what I was talking about in the retreat a lot, right? So if we remember that in the present time, we actually do have agency about what kind of lens. We inherited the lenses of information, association, memory, and our practice is to realize that even now, my perception is based on, there's a present to it, and while it's based on the past, I have agency here to decide what is this meaning to me now. Is it useful to keep on holding that resentment or that sense of how much it has hurt me? Not to deny that, mind you, but from this moment on, what am I going to do with that, right? And again, but by saying that, I don't mean it's going to be easy, right? Okay, I don't want that to affect me. But if that is somebody who's in your life who still beats you up, figuratively or otherwise, then what is your present sense of wanting to deal with that? Which doesn't mean you don't need help, you don't need support. That's not what I mean at all. And just you have to remember that in the present, there is a choice. And that choice be very clearer and clearer about the traces. Is that clear? All right. Now, which also means you need more information. So the more you can get different perspective, the clarity of the trace becomes clearer. And then you get a choice on which part of the trace you want to carry on, you know? Does that make sense? Okay, some facts for y'all. Suzuki Roshi was born to, his father is Butsumon Shogaku Suzuki. His mother was Yone, I believe is how you pronounce her name, Suzuki. Suzuki Roshi was born on May 18th, 1904. Look at that. We're around the same time. He would be 120 years old now. Pretty cool, huh? He was born into a temple shogunji. That's 400 years old, the temple. And when I practiced, it was 500 years old. Shun means emerging or excellent, and Ryu is dragon. Don't forget that in Zen, a dragon is an enlightened person. Also, in general, dragons are mystical, so there's that sense. Japan was fighting Russia in Manchuria in 1904. Suzuki Roshi grew up with a nickname. I don't know about you, but a lot of Asian folks, I'm sure other culture, you always have a nickname. You know, when I went back to Vietnam, I think some of you know this story. My name is Lien, which I thought meant water lotus, which I thought, hey, pretty cool. Like so Buddhist, isn't that? And look at that. Look at the trace that I like, right? And my parents must have knew something I didn't know. So when I went back to Vietnam and practiced at the nunnery, and that was the second time I went back to Vietnam, the interview nun that I worked with, who's a poet, said to me one day, she said, "What does your name mean?" And I said, "Oh, water lotus. Isn't that great?" And she's like, "No, I don't think so, because that's like saying the thing it is, and names should mean something bigger. You know, Tui could mean gold, it could mean blue, it could mean gentle. Are you gentle lotus, blue lotus, gold lotus?" And I was like, "I don't know." So I go to ask my uncle, who's my mother's actual brother, and he says to me, "I don't know. You went by your nickname. Your name's not sweet, right? We all call you that name. I have no one's seen my birth certificate, right? And also the war, I think it was lost. I don't, you know. And in my adoption paper, they had no toner marks and stuff. So I actually don't. Nobody in my family knows what my name actually is, right? I've decided to stay with water lotus, even though it makes no sense, right? So, you know, these are traces. These are things that what do you want to keep and what do you want to carry? Hmm? Luckily, my family now, you know, they don't care. So it's not like someone's like, no, you have to go by XYZ, right? Sutway would just laugh at me about my name. All right. And I brought that up because Suzuki Roshi had a nickname, Toshi, from Toshitaka. He had one older half-brother. So Shogaku, his father, was married before. That story will come later. And then when he was 3, a sister was born, Tori, and then when he was 6 years old, another sister was born, Aiko. And it's important to note that at 6-year-old, when he went to school, he realized how poor his family is. Temples in Japan, as I understand it, are pretty much these days a family business. By that, it means it's been passed on family to family. And you hear that, you know, like, yeah, they've owned for generations. Also, there's a sense that you get sent to temples for a while if your family didn't have a temple. So, and you know, temples are dependent upon the community. So depending how rich the area is or not, that's the state of your, right, the alms thing, my guess was, I don't know, to be perfectly honest, but my sense is probably the Sangha pay dues, or the other name in here is what? Hanaka? Anybody want to jump in to say the name? Oh, the Danka, the community of supporting members. So we say Sangha as that, and Sangha is technically the community of practitioners. But because we've expanded our sense as lay community, we say Sangha in that sense. And it's true, we all practice together. But technically, in the correct way, a Sangha is the actual community. Just like in Theravada, they say the Vihara is the actual people live in the, mostly the monastic, but then there's lay people who support it, right? Who actually live there too. And a lot of them are in training. The other thing is that, they were in time of war. And also, key, on page 7, I think it's important to read 6 to 7. Born in, my Japanese sucks, Karakawa, near Hamamatsu in Shizuoka Prefecture. Shogaku was born from a poor farming family that for generations had also made bamboo stretchers for dyeing cloth. Despite being the eldest son, he left home as a young teenager to be ordained as a Buddhist monk and to become the disciple of a Soto Zen priest named Gyaku Shitsu Shoyun. Shogaku left the responsibility of providing for the family to his younger brother. That's probably unusual. Not that he was leaving home for an easier, more prestigious life. He must have been dedicated and determined, because by the time he was ordained, the Meiji era, 1868 to 1912, had begun, and the old order was out, and Buddhism was no longer in favor with the planners of Japan's future. So if we go then to page 10 to 13, we actually learn more about that, where it says, my life at school was not so happy, so I preferred staying in the classroom rather than playing in the schoolyard. So Shogaku knew that Toshi, that's Suzuki Roshi, was having a hard time at school. The other boys slapped him on top of his bald head whenever his father shaved it. And remember, he did it because they were too poor. And when he shaved his head, he just shaved the kid's head instead of letting him have a hairstyle that was more standard for children, boy children at the time. And they made jokes about his being the son of a priest. So Shogaku sat him down and told him about the Haibutsu Kishaku, the persecution of Buddhism during the Meiji Restoration. Haibutsu Kishaku means throwing out Buddha, breaking Shakyamuni. In 1858, about the time Shogaku was born, Japanese crowds were overwhelmed by the sight of Commodore Perry's black ships in Tokyo Bay. Within a few years, the ruling elite had made radical changes in policy. They decided to make Japan into a modern industrial nation state along the lines of a European constitutional monarchy. A new all-Japanese state religion was needed. Shinto, their omnipresent, mythical, ancient animism, was the only candidate. Thus, a nouveau Shintoism was created, with the emperor at the human apex of creation, regarded far more seriously as a living god than ever before. Buddhist influence was largely squeezed out. In addition to being the titular heads of Shinto, the emperors had been Buddhists for 1,300 years. Now the emperor was elevated to a position that was far higher and exclusively Shinto. Buddhist temples and Shinto shrines had had a close relationship for most of that period, but suddenly Buddhism was represented as foreign and contemplative, and there was a period of heavy persecution. It was an attack on the heart of Japanese culture. Buddhist priests, however, weren't totally innocent victims. Buddhist temples have been an integral part of the shogunate government apparatus, involved with the education of the samurai and nobles. The priests had been the census takers. If anyone wanted to know about a family's background, to learn, for instance, if they were ita, untouchables, their records could be checked at the Buddhist temple. So Buddhism was associated with the old order. The leaders of the Meiji Restoration declared that the old class system, in fact a caste-like system, would be eliminated to be replaced by social equality. The result was not equality, but a shift in power, and Buddhist priests and temples bore the brunt of the shift. In ancient India, Buddha had rejected the caste system, and now, ironically, Buddhism would suffer because it had supported a caste system in Japan. Temples lost land to shrines, and during the worst years, 1868, thugs roamed around burning temples and killing priests. To this day, decapitated stone Buddhas populate cemeteries as relics of the violent anti-Buddhist rages of that year. Soto Zen, one of the largest sects, although associated more with farmers than aristocrats, Rinzai was a samurai and aristocrat, didn't escape this purge. All right, there's more here, and I'll let you read it on your own, but the bottom here. My father told me this kind of story once in a while. Being young, I was very much impressed. I couldn't have a normal life since my friends sometimes made fun of me. Some lay people made fun of monks and young trainees, and I saw them as my enemies. There were so many people who did not respect Buddhism. The government's policy was to weaken Buddhism and promote Shinto as a national religion. I think that is when I made up my mind to be a priest, but not the usual kind of priest. I wanted to be an unusual priest who could tell people what Buddhism is and what the truth is. I wanted to be good enough to give lectures, so I determined to be a good priest. So he decided to become a priest, and he decided his father was too weak, as he put it, and I'll let you read that on your own, but he did make a critical, at the bottom here, Toshi had made the first two critical decisions of his life by age 11, to become a monk and to leave Kanagawa. Right? My ambition at that time was directed toward a narrow idea of attainment, but I made up my mind to leave my home and to practice under a strict teacher. This is interesting. He had been impressed by a popular Buddhist belief that by being ordained, one saves one's ancestors for 9 generations back. But where should he go? With whom should he study? It was March 1916, and he had just graduated from elementary school. Right? So he decided to go to his father's first disciple at his former temple, Shunryu. So that's with Keiryū, Soen Suzuki. Right? I guess it was Hiraku's adopted son. I didn't remember that part. All right. So he thought he made the decision. There's a point here where his parents was like, oh, that's a good idea, because if Kyoku-kujin became abbot, then the lineage would go directly to his son to become the next abbot. And so then they could move there. And it was a richer temple. And they had some traces about leaving, which you would read in the beginning of the chapter. So the point is there are always traces, right? Knowing them in any way you can, but I would say most of us realize the traces from the past more easily than we notice our traces now, right? But whenever you notice them, so technically they're later, but anytime you notice them, it's part of understanding ourselves, right? And our ancestors and the context here of things. So now, when I first read this thing about the Buddhist belief that being ordained saves one ancestor for 9 generations back, when I was in Thailand, they said, it gives merit to your family, but I didn't hear the generation back bit. And I was like, why backwards? You think it would be forward. But now I realize, I mean, to me, one thing I realize is that when we have some sense of the traces of our ancestors and how they make this decision and therefore for our lives, it gives us some context, right? And actually, on a certain level, this is my take, we practice to, in a way, do what we can to rectify that karma. That's basically what it is. Karma is that habitual energy, especially unconscious one, that keeps on moving forward. You know, and when I was a social worker and getting a master, first thing they did was like, go do a family history tree and talk to people from the past. And so many of us discover secrets and things that generations just carry on, like some secret that wasn't told before, and yet you find out now, and then people just keep acting on it, even though it was unconscious, right? And so in a way, that's what we're doing. We're always going, oh, how has the present been informed by the past? And what is it that I'm willing to say, no more? Or I don't need to carry that anymore, especially the ones that keep on bringing hurt and harm to myself or future generations, right? Or those around me, for that matter. So this is why our mind should be free from traces of the past, just like the flowers of spring. So just like firewood and ash, hint, hint, from the retreat, right? One way of being free of traces is to realize that they are decision made in that moment. Because in this moment, if I'm saying in this moment, I have a choice, right? And what is karma? In this moment, we make a decision, and now it becomes a trace for the next moment. Always leaves a trace until we can act not out of hatred, greed, or delusion. And since I live in 99.9% of the time in delusion, the chance of the trace, some part of the trace, 99.9% of it, continuing, right? So you might be going, well, what the fuck? Then should I be doing this, right? Why should, okay, you're signing off already. You're like, you know, 1/100th, right? 1/100th of a percent is huge, huge. And just stopping or making some effort to just stop the momentum. That's what we're doing. This is why the how is so important. It's good to know the content of the traces, because that's how things carry on, right? The stories. And what we're doing is we're actually making a choice about the how that we move forward, right? Because that's what it comes down to, right? The stories sometimes live on, but the how do we tell the story? How do we relate to the story? How are we going to move the story forward? With honesty, with authenticity. And are we transparent about that? You know, introduction. Basically, David's going, I'm being transparent. I don't understand half of this shit. Here are the people I talk to and the sources, and I'm doing my best effort. I got the okay. You know, even, and that's, you know, how he started out by talking Mrs. Suzuki Roshi is very much David. You know, he didn't push his way in, right? And of course, he had access, blah, blah, blah. That goes without saying, right? So you can't escape the traces. We need to know them. We need to be transparent about them. And we need to also realize that we do have a choice with them. And the how are we with them is the key. Thank you for listening. All right. My sense of Japanese history sucks. So anyone who wants to say any more about Japanese history that knows, feel free. All right, or anyone else about any of this? Yes.
With a danka, from my family in Japan, my understanding of like a danka is, because in one city there can be many temples.
Mm-hmm.
So for my father's family, the temple that they support is for funerals. It's very much a part of doing a funeral, and then the many memorials. Like there's a 7-year, 25-year,
2 years, 3 years.
Yeah, there's many memorials. So you're offering financial support for the priest to help your family honor people in your family who passed. So that's how I've always seen the family temple.
Mm-hmm.
That's the main thing. Because weddings are not Buddhist generally. Like in Japan, weddings are generally a Shinto ceremony, and then a funeral though is a Buddhist ceremony. I mean, there's probably families that are really Buddhist or really Shinto, but generally it's both.
Yeah, it's interesting. When I was in Japan, it was a small temple, and it was a Soto Zen training temple. So there were only 12 of us most of the time. Occasionally there was 13 or 11, but and we did all the ceremony, but the only ceremony I was not allowed to go to is funerals. The foreigners couldn't be part of the funeral. So at this time, at least around Hoshinji and Obama, Japan, they're Buddhists. What happens in a Buddhist funeral for the most part? You're given the precepts. Everything in Soto Zen is just the precepts over and over and over. But yeah.